Welcome everybody to episode number 4. We're going to go over the proper way to measure your arrow and how to mark it so that you can cut it the right length. You don't want to cut it too short or too long once you figure out what the proper length is for you. You can see I got my 2 assistants here. It's Owen and Hannah. They're usually here in the arrow shop with me, and they get to help out every once in a while. But right now they're just going to sit there and look good. Okay, so the proper measurement for your arrow is from the valley of the nock to the back of the point, which is normally where your taper starts. And the reason why we measured the back of the point is because the points come in different lengths. So these are both 11/32 points. You can see here we have a 190 grain, and here we have a 100 grain. Different manufacturers also will change the length some depending on the type of steel that they're using. So they're not all the same. So that's why we always measure to the back of the point, because that should always be consistent with the back side of your taper. So that's what it means when on my website, when I list the length as BOP, it stands for back of point. So it's always from the valley of the nock. And the reason why we use the valley of the nock is, again, that will be consistent depending on the style of nock that you shoot. What I normally use is a Boning Classic nock. But there's also Bear Paws, there's Mercuries, there's Snap-ons, there's T-nocks made by Boning. They're all different. And the length of the ears of the nock can be a different size as well. That's why we measure from the valley. That is where your string is going to sit. Okay? Here's, I've made up this board. I've got a notch cut out on this side. Notch cut off here. And what that does is when my arrow sits in there, this starting point here where I measured the measurements off of is sitting at the valley of the nock, so I can mark the tips. Okay. Now the length of a taper on an 11/32 is about 7/8 of an inch. So an 11/32 diameter, by the time you put a 5-degree taper on there, it's going to be 7/8 of an inch on there. So you got to take that into account. So what that means is, let's say for example we want a 30-inch arrow. We actually want to cut the tip of our wood to 30 7/8, and by the time we taper, it'll be back to 30 inches, and then when we put our point on, you'll be at that 30-inch line. So we got to take that into account. So when we go to cut wood, mark your line. If you can get yourself a nice sharp box knife, depending on the wood, Portoford cedar and Doug fir, you can get away with it sometimes. Put your knife on there and roll the shaft back and forth. And basically what you're going to do is score it. And you're going to score it all the way around the shaft. Again, I wouldn't recommend doing this all the time, but if you're in a pinch, score it around there. And you sit there and you can break it off. Break it off like that. You see it's not a completely clean break, but it's clean enough to where you take your last little bit and you can then taper that. Okay. Probably should go without saying, be very careful doing this. I've actually cut myself pretty good with this. So again, not something I recommend doing if you're going to do this to a dozen arrows, but if you're in a pinch and you need to cut 1 or 2, you can do it that way. Second option. I think these are called little Japanese saws. It's a very fine tooth saw. You get yourself a little block, you can stick it in there. You want to make sure you cut it square. Again, these saws work as you pull to you, so you get started, stay in the grooves, nice square cut. Okay. Again, this is one at a time. You can see it's kind of difficult because the shaft will want to go down and kick this up, and you have the possibility of cutting it down at an angle. You don't want to do that. The other option is to make up a board. This board has a nice deep groove in it. You can stick multiple shafts in there with the stop. You can rubber band them down. Once you get it in there, then you can use a bigger saw. Again, if you have them nice and supported all the way across, the arrows aren't going to be sitting down at an angle, and you can actually, with this, cut multiple shafts at the same time. Speed things up. Great way to go if you're going to make, 1 to 2 dozen a year. Okay, another option for cutting wood arrows is a little mini chop saw. This can be pretty inexpensive. Best thing to do is to mount these. I used to have this mounted up on a board with a guide so that you want your arrow to sit square to the blade, because if not, you'll end up cutting it at a wrong angle. Okay, so if you can mount this onto a stop or onto a board and then put a stop on one side, you can actually get through a dozen pretty quick with this. The other way to do it is by a chop saw or band saw. I recommend that you bundle the whole dozen together. I will normally cut one arrow, taper it, make sure that I'll double check myself to make sure that I have the proper length, again, from the valley of the knob to the back of the point or the start of the taper. And then I will mark it, put it back into the dozen, and wrap them up tight so then they're in one unit. So big thing to remember when you're cutting with a chop saw is you want to cut through really slow, because if you go through too fast, it'll actually tear through your shafts and you'll end up with splintered edges. So if you just take your time, use a fine-toothed blade like I have here. This is actually a finished blade. You should be able to cut through your dozen there, no problem. Well, I hope you enjoyed part 4 on how to properly measure the length of your arrow so that you can cut them the right way. I hope I gave you some tips and tricks that will help you or that you'll find useful. If you get a chance, please leave me a comment below and I will try to answer any questions that you have or cover them in future episodes. Thank you.